Take a deep breath now, slowly and fully. Feel it fill your chest, your ribs, your quiet heart. Find the way you wish to listen, resting, reclining, or sitting in still awareness. Let comfort find you. We spend much of life moving from one thing to the next, thought to thought, task to task. But Zen reminds us that peace hides not in the doing, but in the pause between all things. These stories live in that pause. They are not meant to be solved or remembered, but to be felt. If you wish, share where you're listening from, or what you hope to rediscover tonight. Maybe patience, maybe calm, maybe a truth you once knew, but forgot. The pause has already begun, and now we begin the story together. In a village rebuilding after a great earthquake, there was a master mason named Takeo who was known throughout the region for building walls that followed precise specifications. Every stone placed according to traditional methods, every measurement exact, every joint perfect. His walls were architectural achievements, admired by other masons and praised in the capital. When the earthquake struck and buildings collapsed throughout the region, everyone expected Takeo's walls to stand as a testament to proper craftsmanship. Instead, most of his carefully built walls fell. The perfect joints fractured. The precisely placed stones tumbled. All that meticulous work reduced to rubble. But there was one wall that remained standing, and it puzzled everyone. It was a wall that Takeo's apprentice, a young man named Jiro, had built in the early days of his training. The wall wasn't straight. It curved and bent in unusual ways. The stones weren't uniform or perfectly fitted. By every standard of proper masonry, the wall was wrong. Takeo had been embarrassed by it, had planned to tear it down and rebuild it properly, but had never gotten around to it. Now that the crooked, imperfect wall stood while all of Takeo's masterpieces lay in ruins. After the earthquake, people would visit that wall, marveling at how something so improperly built had survived when everything correct had fallen. Takeo was humbled and confused. He went to examine the crooked wall carefully, trying to understand what accidental wisdom it contained. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about his craft. The wall's curves and bends, which he had seen as flaws, had actually allowed it to flex during the earthquake, rather than rigidly resisting the force. The imperfect joints had given the structure some ability to shift without completely fracturing. The irregular stones had created a kind of organic stability that precise, uniform stones couldn't achieve. "I built this wall wrong," Jiro said when he and Takeo examined it together. "I was new. I didn't know the proper methods yet. I just placed stones in ways that felt stable." "You built it intuitively," Takeo replied slowly, "while I built with rigid adherence to rules. Your intuition understood something about forces and flexibility that the traditional methods don't account for. The rules made sense for normal conditions, but they weren't designed for extreme stress. Your ignorance of the rules allowed you to respond to the actual needs of the situation." An engineer from the capital came to study the surviving wall. He measured its curves, examined its composition, and tried to understand its principles. "This wall shouldn't have stood," he said finally. "By every calculation, every principle of proper construction, it should have fallen. But clearly, our principles are incomplete. This wall knows something we don't." Takeo spent months studying not just Jiro's wall, but other structures that had survived. He found a pattern. The buildings that stood weren't always the ones built most correctly. Often, they were the ones with irregular features, with imperfections that accidentally created flexibility. The traditional methods, designed over centuries for stable conditions, weren't necessarily best for extreme conditions. He began incorporating these insights into his new work. He still used traditional methods as a foundation, but he added intentional irregularities, curves instead of straight lines, flexible joints instead of rigid joints of rigid ones, and organic shapes instead of perfect geometry. Other masons criticized him. "You're violating the principles," they said. "You're building incorrectly." "I'm building for survival rather than for appearance," Takeo replied. The old principles were based on aesthetic ideals and normal conditions. "I'm building for abnormal conditions based on what actually survived when everything else fell." His new walls looked less impressive than his old ones. They weren't as straight, as precise, as aesthetically pleasing. But when another earthquake struck years later, these walls stood. The traditional walls, built by masons who still adhered to the old, correct methods, fell again. Takeo's irregular, imperfect walls flexed and bent and survived. "What's more important?" Takeo asked his critics. "Building correctly according to traditional standards, or building what actually works?" "My old walls were perfect and dead. My new walls are imperfect and alive." He trained a new generation of masons in what he called flexible building. They learned the traditional methods, but also learned when to deviate from them, when to trust intuition over rules, and when to value survival over correctness. "The crooked wall saved my life," Takeo would tell students. Not just physically, by remaining standing during the earthquake, but professionally and spiritually, by taught me that correctness isn't the same as truth. Something can be done exactly right according to established principles and still fail when conditions change. And something can be done wrong and still succeed because it responds to actual conditions rather than theoretical ideals. One student asked, "So should we ignore all the traditional methods?" "No," Takeo replied. "Learn them, understand them, but don't worship them. Rules are tools, not truths. They work until they don't. The crooked wall taught me to pay attention to what actually works, rather than what should work according to theory. Sometimes the imperfect, the irregular, the supposedly wrong thing contains wisdom that perfection misses." He would take students to see Jiro's wall, still standing decades after the earthquake that revealed its value. "This wall is a better teacher than any master mason," he would say. "It teaches that survival often comes from flexibility rather than rigidity, from imperfection that allows adaptation rather than perfection that allows no variation. It teaches that what's wrong by one standard might be right by a more important standard." The wall became something of a shrine. People would visit it, touch it, and remember that sometimes what appears to be failure or imperfection is actually hidden success. That correctness and effectiveness aren't always the same thing. That rules have limits, and intuition has wisdom. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the crooked walls in your life, the things you've done imperfectly, irregularly, against the rules or proper methods. Perhaps these apparent flaws are actually what allowed you to survive, when others who did everything correctly fell apart. Perhaps your imperfections are flexibilities that rigid perfection lacks. You don't have to do everything correctly. You don't have to follow every rule or meet every standard. Sometimes the crooked wall stands when the straight wall falls. Sometimes your irregular, imperfect, supposedly wrong way of doing things is actually what works best for the conditions you're actually in, rather than the ideal conditions that rules assume. Rest now in acceptance of your crooked walls. They may not look perfect. They may not meet conventional standards, but they've kept you standing when straight walls would have crumbled. Your imperfections aren't failures. They're flexible, and flexibility is what allows survival when everything rigid breaks. The crooked wall knows this. Now you know it too. In a monastery where monks practiced intensive meditation, there was a monk named Genzo, who struggled more than any of the others. While his fellow monks seemed to make progress, reporting experiences of insight and clarity, Genzo felt nothing but confusion and exhaustion. He tried so hard. He would sit in meditation until his legs ached and his back screamed. He would concentrate fiercely, trying to force his mind into the states he read about in the sutras. He would stay up late studying, trying to understand intellectually what he couldn't grasp experientially. But nothing seemed to work. While others reported breakthrough moments, sudden insights, and powerful experiences during meditation, Genzo just felt tired. So tired that he would sometimes fall asleep during meditation sessions, which filled him with shame. The other monks were achieving enlightenment, and he couldn't even stay awake. The monastery's teacher, Master Dogen, watched Genzo's struggle with patient concern. He saw how the young monk was wearing himself out, how the desperate striving was actually creating obstacles rather than removing them. One day after Genzo had fallen asleep during meditation yet again and woken up mortified, Dogen called him aside. "Genzo, you look exhausted. When did you last sleep a full night?" "I can't afford to sleep, Master. I'm so far behind the others. I need to practice more, not less." "Go to your room and sleep," Dogen said gently. "That's not a suggestion. It's an instruction. Sleep for as long as your body needs." Genzo was confused but obedient. He went to his room, lay down, and immediately fell into the deepest sleep he'd had in months. He slept through the afternoon, through the evening meditation, through the night, and into the next morning. When he finally woke, something was different. He couldn't name what had changed, but the world looked somehow clearer. The desperate striving that had consumed him was just gone. He felt a quietness inside that he'd never experienced before. He went to find Dogen, unsure what to say about this strange shift. "Master, something happened while I slept, but I don't know what. I feel different, but I didn't have any dramatic experience, any sudden insight. I just slept." Dogen smiled. "And in that sleep, you let go of trying. You let go of the desperate effort to achieve enlightenment. You stopped fighting with yourself. And in that letting go, what was always there became apparent." "But I didn't do anything," Genzo protested. "I just slept." "The others have profound experiences during meditation. I fell asleep." "Enlightenment isn't always dramatic," Dogen explained. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it comes not through effort, but through the cessation of effort. You've been trying so hard to wake up that you couldn't see you were already awake. You needed to sleep, to let go, to stop trying, for what's always been true to become obvious. Over the following days, Genzo noticed that the peace hadn't left him. It wasn't a dramatic altered state. It was more like a background quietness, a sense of okayness that didn't depend on circumstances. The desperate seeking was gone, not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had realized he'd never lost it. Other monks asked him what had happened. Did you have a breakthrough, a sudden awakening? I don't know, Genzo replied honestly. I just slept. And when I woke up, something had shifted. But it wasn't like lightning striking. It was more like clouds clearing and realizing the sky had been there all along. Master Dogen used Genzo's experience to teach others. Many of you are waiting for dramatic enlightenment experiences. Thunder and lightning, profound insights, altered states. But enlightenment is often more subtle than that. It's the quiet recognition of what's always been true. It's the simple shift from trying to be at peace to noticing the peace that's already here. Years later, when Genzo told his story to students, he would laugh at his younger self. I was trying so hard to wake up that I exhausted myself. I thought enlightenment was something to achieve through effort. But sometimes you have to stop trying to wake up and just let yourself sleep. Sometimes awakening comes through the door you're not watching. Tonight, stop trying so hard. Stop striving for perfect meditation or ideal relaxation or correct rest. Stop watching for enlightenment or breakthroughs or special experiences. Just sleep. Just let go. Just be tired and allow yourself rest without judgment. What you're seeking might come not through your effort, but through your willingness to stop efforting and simply be. Sleep through your own awakening if you must. It will be there when you wake. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a tale about recognition and the true nature of worth. This is the next story. In a valley between two mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. The villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. "My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction?" "Tell me about your son," Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. "It's backwards," she insisted. "Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature." "Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing," Fumiko suggested gently. "Is he talented musically?" "Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding rather than surface appearance." She pointed to the river. "This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. In a village known for pottery, there lived a potter named Masao, who had studied for decades under the greatest masters. He created bowls, cups, and vessels of exceptional quality, each piece perfectly formed, perfectly glazed, perfectly fired. His work was sought after by tea masters and collectors, and he took enormous pride in never releasing a flawed piece. Any pot that emerged from the kiln with even the slightest imperfection, Masao would destroy immediately. A hairline crack, an uneven glaze, a slight asymmetry, these were intolerable failures in his eyes. His studio floor was littered with shards of pieces that hadn't met his exacting standards. One day, Masao created a tea bowl for the most important commission of his life. The provincial governor had requested a ceremonial bowl for an upcoming tea gathering with the emperor. Masao worked on this bowl for weeks, preparing the clay with unusual care, forming it with absolute precision, applying the glaze with perfect evenness. When he opened the kiln after firing, his heart sank. The bowl was magnificent in form, perfect in proportion, beautiful in color. But there, running from the rim down the side, was a crack. Not a dramatic break, but a fine line that compromised the bowl's perfection. Masao's first instinct was to smash it immediately, as he did with all flawed work. But the deadline was close, and he had no time to create another bowl of this quality. He sat staring at the cracked bowl, torn between his standards and his practical needs. Finally, he decided to show it to the governor and explain the situation, offering to work day and night to create a replacement. When he presented the bowl and apologized for its flaw, the governor examined it carefully. "This crack," the governor said, tracing it with his finger. "It's interesting. It adds something to the piece. It makes it unique." "It makes it flawed," Masao protested. "A tea bowl should be perfect. This crack means the bowl could fail, could break apart entirely. It's a structural weakness." "Or it's a story," the governor replied. "This bowl is telling us something, that even in our most careful efforts, nature has its own say. The fire does what it will. The clay responds according to its own nature. Your perfect technique met forces beyond your control, and this crack is the conversation between them." He held the bowl up to the light. "I think I'll use this bowl for the emperor's tea." A perfect bowl says nothing except, "Look how skilled the potter is." This bowl says something more interesting. "Look how skill and accident can create something neither could create alone." Masao was unconvinced but had no choice. The governor kept the cracked bowl. On the day of the emperor's visit, Masao attended the tea ceremony, anxious about his flawed work being used in such an important context. The emperor held the bowl, examining it from every angle. He paused at the crack, running his thumb along it thoughtfully. Masao held his breath, certain his reputation was about to be destroyed. "This crack," the emperor said finally, "is the most honest thing in this entire ceremony. Everything else is pretending to be perfect. The precise movements, the practiced words, the carefully arranged flowers. But this bowl admits it's not perfect. It shows its vulnerability. And in doing so, it invites us to be real rather than ceremonial." He looked directly at Masao. "Did you make this crack deliberately?" "No, Your Majesty," Masao admitted. "It's a flaw. I almost destroyed the bowl because of it." "Then it's a gift," the emperor replied. "A deliberate crack would be pretentious, a manufactured authenticity. But this crack happened. The bowl is showing us the truth of its making, that fire and clay have their own will, that perfection is an illusion, that beauty can include what we consider flaws." After the ceremony, a renowned tea master approached Masao. "That bowl is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's cracked," Masao said, still unable to accept this interpretation. "Exactly," the tea master replied. "Your perfect bowls are impressive but distant. They're so perfect they feel inhuman, unreal. But this bowl with its crack is approachable. It's marked by the actual process of its creation. It doesn't pretend to be more than what it is, clay and glaze and fire meeting imperfectly." He held the bowl carefully. "In the tea ceremony, we value wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection, impermanence, and incompleteness. Your perfect bowls violate wabi-sabi. They're trying too hard to be permanent, complete, perfect. This cracked bowl embodies wabi-sabi perfectly. It shows age before it's even been used. It admits its fragility. It's honest." Over the following weeks, Masao struggled with this new perspective. His entire career had been built on the pursuit of perfection, on the elimination of flaws. Now he was being told that his flawed bowl was his finest work precisely because of its flaw. He began to experiment. He still created bowls with his full skill and attention, but he stopped destroying pieces that emerged with cracks, asymmetries, or irregularities. He studied these flawed pieces, trying to understand what made some flaws interesting and others merely defects. He discovered something subtle. There were flaws that came from carelessness or poor technique, and these did diminish the work. But some flaws came from the honest interaction of materials and fire, and these often added something that perfect technique alone could never achieve. The cracked bowl became famous. Tea masters throughout the region requested pieces from Masao that had this quality of honest imperfection. He became known not for perfect bowls, but for bowls that told the truth of their making, that showed the conversation between intention and accident, control and surrender. "I spent 30 years trying to eliminate every flaw," Masao would tell students who came to learn from him. "I thought my job was to impose my will perfectly on clay and fire. But actually, my job is to create conditions and then allow the fire to have its say. The crack in that bowl taught me that some of what I called flaws were actually the fire's contribution to the work. I was rejecting collaboration, insisting on control. The crack showed me a better way. He would show students 2 bowls, one perfect by traditional standards, one marked by a crack or asymmetry. Which is more beautiful? The answer depends on what you value. If you value technical mastery and perfect execution, choose the perfect bowl. If you value honesty and the authentic marks of process, choose the cracked one. Neither is wrong, but I wasted decades making only one kind of bowl because I couldn't see value in the other. A young potter asked, "So should we try to make flawed pieces? Should we create cracks deliberately?" "No," Masao replied firmly. "Deliberate cracks are dishonest, just a performance of imperfection. Do your best work, use your full skill and attention, then accept what emerges, including the flaws. Some flaws you'll need to recognize as failures, results of inattention or poor technique that you can learn from. But some flaws you'll need to recognize as gifts, contributions from forces beyond your control that add something you couldn't have planned." He held up the famous cracked bowl, now aged and stained from years of use. "This bowl has served the emperor and countless tea masters. The crack never caused it to fail. Instead, the crack gave it character, made it memorable, and allowed it to teach something that perfect bowls never could. What I considered its fatal flaw was actually its finest feature." Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider your own cracks, your own flaws, the things about yourself or your life that don't meet your standards of perfection. What if some of these aren't failures but features? What if what you consider your greatest weakness is actually adding something that strength alone never could? The cracked bowl served perfectly. Its flaw didn't prevent it from holding tea. It enhanced its ability to hold meaning. Your flaws might work the same way. They might not prevent you from serving your purpose. They might deepen it, make it more honest, more relatable, more real. Rest now in acceptance of your cracks. Not every imperfection is a gift, but some are. Not every flaw adds value, but some do. The question isn't whether you're perfect. You're not, and you never will be. The question is whether your imperfections are honest marks of your making, authentic results of your interaction with forces beyond your control. Those kinds of flaws don't diminish you. They complete you. The potter's cracked bowl teaches that perfection isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is authenticity, honesty, and the willingness to show the truth of your process, including its imperfections. Sleep now as a cracked bowl, flawed but functional, imperfect but honest, broken in ways that somehow make you more whole. As we move deeper into the quiet teachings of Zen, we come to a story about seeing clearly and understanding true value. Listen carefully to the next story. At the edge of a village stood a house whose small garden received almost no direct sunlight. Tall buildings on either side cast shadows that leave the garden in shade for all but an hour each day. The previous owners had tried repeatedly to grow sun-loving flowers and vegetables, but everything either died or grew weak and spindly, stretching desperately toward the brief sliver of light. When Yuki moved into the house, neighbors warned her about the garden. "Nothing grows there," they said. "The shade is too deep. Better to pave it over and use it for storage." But Yuki looked at the shaded space differently. "It's not that nothing can grow here," she said. "It's that sun-loving plants can't grow here." The garden isn't bad. It's just suited for different things than the previous owners were trying to grow. She began researching plants that thrived in shade, ferns that loved the dim moisture, hostas with broad leaves that caught what little light appeared, shade-loving flowers that bloomed in muted colors, but with delicate beauty. Instead of fighting the garden's nature, she worked with it. Within a year, Yuki's shaded garden was lush and beautiful. It didn't look like sunny gardens with their bright flowers and robust vegetables. It had a different aesthetic, subtle, cool, mysterious. The greens were deeper, the flowers were more delicate. The whole space had a quality of quiet richness that sun-blasted gardens never achieved. Neighbors who had declared the space hopeless came to see what Yuki had created. They were amazed, though some were still dismissive. "It's pretty," one neighbor said, "but it's not a real garden. Real gardens have tomatoes and sunflowers and bright colors. Your garden is just making the best of bad conditions." "Are it conditions bad?" Yuki asked. "Or just different conditions?" "These ferns and hostas are barely surviving. They're thriving. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do in exactly the kind of environment they need. The previous owners failed because they tried to grow sun plants in shade. I'm succeeding because I'm growing shade plants in shade." She touched a particularly lush fern. "This plant would die in full sun. It needs shade. For this fern, my garden isn't difficult conditions, it's ideal conditions. The mistake is measuring all gardens by sun garden standards and calling everything else deficient." A young woman named Hannah, who lived nearby, was struck by this perspective. Hannah had always felt like she was growing in the shade in difficult circumstances that made the kind of success others achieved impossible for her. She had health issues that limited her energy. She lived in poverty, which restricted her opportunities. She lacked the family support that others took for granted. Everyone told her she needed to overcome these limitations, to find more light, to transform her difficult conditions into easier ones. But what if, like Yuki's garden, she just needed to stop trying to grow like a sun plant and instead discover how to thrive as a shade plant? She came to talk with Yuki about this idea. "I feel like I'm always failing," Hannah admitted, "because I can't achieve what healthy, wealthy people with family support achieve. I'm trying to grow tomatoes in shade, basically. But I don't know what the equivalent of shade plants would be for a human life." Yuki walked her through the garden, explaining her choices. "See how I chose plants that need less energy? That's like you choosing work that fits your energy levels rather than jobs that demand more than you can give. See how I selected plants that thrive in cool, moist conditions? That's like you finding strengths that develop specifically because of your limitations, not despite them." She pointed to a particularly beautiful shade flower. "This would never survive in full sun. Its delicate petals would burn. But here, protected from harsh light, it blooms with a beauty that sun lovers can't achieve." Your limitations might protect you from certain kinds of harm while allowing you to develop qualities that people in easier conditions never develop. Hannah began to reconsider her entire life. What if she stopped measuring herself by sun garden standards? What if she found shade garden ways to thrive? She had deep empathy, probably developed through her own suffering. She had patience, learned through chronic illness. She had creativity in making do with little, born from poverty. These weren't consolation prizes for failing at normal success. These were actual strengths, shade plant qualities that were valuable in themselves. She started making different choices. She took a job that paid less, but required less energy, allowing her to work sustainably rather than constantly burning out. She developed friendships with others who lived in shade, creating community with people who understood difficult circumstances. She stopped apologizing for needing things that others didn't need, recognizing that shade plants legitimately need different care than sun plants. Word spread about Yuki's garden and the perspective it represented. People who felt they were growing in difficult conditions began to see themselves differently. A man with learning disabilities stopped trying to compete in academic environments and found work that used his practical intelligence. A woman with anxiety stopped forcing herself into high-stress social situations and built a life that honored her need for quiet. A family with limited income stopped feeling inadequate for not achieving wealth and found richness in their strong relationships. The shade garden teaching, as people began to call it, spread beyond individuals to organizations. A school started creating shade garden programs for students who couldn't thrive in standard classroom environments. A business developed positions specifically designed for people with limitations that made traditional jobs difficult. A community center created spaces for people who needed accommodations that mainstream spaces didn't provide. Not everyone appreciated this perspective. Some critics said it encouraged people to accept limitations rather than overcoming them. "You're telling people to give up," they argued, "to accept that they can't thrive in normal conditions rather than working to change their circumstances." Yuki would answer these critics by walking them through her garden. "Look at these plants. Should they be working to become sun plants? Should they be trying to overcome their shade-thriving nature? Or should they be celebrated for being excellent at what they actually are?" She would point to a struggling plant that needed more light. "Sometimes you do need to change conditions. This plant is genuinely in the wrong place. It needs to be moved to a more light-filled place. But most of these plants, they're exactly where they should be, thriving in conditions that sun plants would call impossible." The question isn't whether to overcome all limitations. The question is whether your limitations are like shade for a shade plant, the right conditions for your actual nature, or like shade for a sun plant, wrong conditions that need to change. A teacher named Nobuo applied this to his classroom. He stopped trying to make all students thrive in the same way. He recognized that some students were sun plants who needed bright, fast-paced, competitive environments. Others were shade plants that needed quiet, slow, supportive conditions. Trying to make shade plant students compete in sun plant ways was as futile as trying to grow ferns in full sun. He created different pathways through his curriculum, different ways to demonstrate learning, and different environments within his classroom. And he found that students he had previously considered struggling were actually thriving. They just needed shade garden conditions to show what they could do. Years later, Yuki's garden became something of a pilgrimage site for people living in difficult circumstances. They would come to see that lushness was possible even in shade, that beauty didn't require ideal conditions, that thriving could look different from what sunny gardens showed. Yuki, now elderly, would sit in her garden talking with visitors. "The hardest thing," she would tell them, is stopping comparing yourself to sun gardens. Stop measuring your lushness by their standards. Stop trying to be bright when your beauty is subtle. Once you accept that you're a shade garden, once you stop apologizing for it and start working with it, you discover possibilities you never knew existed. She would touch the ferns and hostas she had planted decades earlier, now mature and magnificent. These plants are barely surviving in bad conditions. They're thriving in ideal conditions for their nature. The shade isn't their obstacle, it's their element. And the same might be true for you. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider the shade you're growing in. The difficult conditions you've been taught to see as obstacles might actually be the right environment for who you actually are. Not who you think you should be, not who sun gardens demand, but who you actually are. Stop trying to grow sun plants in shade. Stop measuring yourself by standards designed for different conditions. Start asking, what does thriving look like for a shade plant? What can I grow that loves these exact conditions? What beauty can emerge specifically because of these limitations, not despite them? Rest now in your shade garden. Let yourself be a fern, a hosta, a delicate shade flower. Stop burning yourself trying to bloom in full sun. Sink into the cool moisture of your actual conditions and discover what wants to grow there. Shade isn't a deficiency. It's just a different light. And different light creates different beauty. Trust that yours is worth growing. With each step on the Zen path, a new lesson unfolds. Now we turn to a story about recognition, of self, of others, and of what truly matters. Listen carefully to the next story. In a garden temple, the monks kept a beautiful crane named Haku in a large bamboo enclosure. Haku had been brought to the temple as an injured chick, nursed back to health, and raised in the enclosure where he was safe from predators and provided with ample food. For 3 years, Haku lived comfortably in his bamboo home. The monks fed him daily, cleaned his space, and even spoke to him in gentle tones. He had everything a crane could need except freedom, though the monks assured themselves they were keeping him safe. One day, a traveling priest named Osho visited the temple and saw Haku in his enclosure. The priest noticed that Haku's wings had grown strong and full. He was clearly capable of flight, yet he never attempted to fly beyond the bamboo walls, even though portions of the enclosure were open to the sky. "Why doesn't your crane fly away?" Osho asked the monks. "He could if he wanted to," one monk replied. "We don't clip his wings." "But he stays because he knows this is where his food comes, where he's safe, where he belongs." Osho watched Haku for several days. The crane would walk around his enclosure, occasionally stretching his wings, but never attempting actual flight. It was as if Haku had forgotten that flight was even possible, that his wings had any purpose beyond stretching. On his last day at the temple, Osho asked permission to enter Haku's enclosure. He approached the crane slowly, then suddenly clapped his hands and shouted, startling Haku into the air. The crane's wings opened instinctively, and for a moment, Haku was flying, truly flying, circling above the enclosure in surprise. But after only 2 circles, Haku landed back in his familiar corner, as if the brief flight had frightened rather than thrilled him. He settled back into his routine immediately, walking the same worn paths he always walked. The monks were angry. "You scared him! You could have hurt him!" "I showed him he could fly," Osho replied calmly. but he chose to land. That choice tells me something important. Your crane is imprisoned not by bamboo walls, but by comfort. He could leave any time, but he won't, because the enclosure has become more familiar than freedom. He looked at the monks gathered around him. And before you judge Haku too harshly, ask yourselves, how are you different? How many of you are living in comfortable enclosures of your own making, never attempting to fly because the familiar is safer than the possible? One young monk, named Botan, was particularly struck by this question. He realized he had been at the temple for 5 years, had taken preliminary vows, but had never fully committed to the monastic life. He was comfortable in this in-between state, receiving the structure and security of monastery life without the full commitment it demanded. Like Haku, he had wings he never used. After Osho left, Botan couldn't stop thinking about the crane. He began to see Haku differently, not as a bird being kept safe, but as a bird being kept comfortable in a cage he could leave any time. And he began to see himself the same way. He started paying attention to all the ways the monastery had become his comfortable enclosure. He knew when every meal would come. He knew exactly what each day would bring. He had routines that felt safe, relationships that felt predictable, a life that felt controlled. And he realized this comfort was preventing him from attempting the flight that monastic life was actually meant to enable. The leap into full commitment, into genuine spiritual practice, into the risk and uncertainty that real transformation requires. I've been living like Haku, Botan confessed to the abbot, safe and comfortable, but not really alive. Not really practicing, just walking the same familiar paths day after day. The abbot, who'd been troubled by Osho's words about the crane, nodded. You're not alone. Many of us have made the monastery into a comfortable cage rather than a launching place. We've mistaken security for wisdom, routine for practice, comfort for peace. He gestured toward Haku's enclosure. The priest was right to startle the crane into flight. Not to frighten him, but to remind him what his wings were for. Perhaps we all need to be startled sometimes, reminded that we have wings we're not using, capabilities we're not exercising, flights we're not attempting, because the ground feels safer. The monks began to look at their own lives with new eyes. They noticed patterns of comfortable avoidance, ways they stayed safely within self-imposed limits, flights they could attempt but didn't. The monastery, meant to be a place of transformation, had become for many a place of comfortable stagnation. Gradually, changes began to happen. Monks who had been avoiding difficult practices began to attempt them. Commitments that had been postponed were made. Risks that had seemed too frightening were taken. Not everyone changed. Some preferred the comfortable enclosure, but many discovered they had wings they had forgotten about. As for Haku, the monks began to encourage him to fly, taking him to open areas and gently startling him into the air. At first, he would fly only briefly before landing back in familiar territory, but eventually, his flights grew longer. One day, Haku flew beyond the temple grounds entirely and didn't return. The monks felt both loss and joy. They had loved having Haku, but they recognized that keeping him comfortable had been keeping him caged. Setting him free, truly free, not just free within limits, was the compassionate thing, even though it meant losing him. Botan, watching Haku disappear into the distance, felt inspired. If a crane can remember how to fly after 3 years of comfortable captivity, then surely I can remember what I came here to do. I've been in my bamboo enclosure long enough. He took his final vows that week, fully committing to monastic life. It was terrifying in a way his comfortable half-commitment had never been. But it was also exhilarating, like stretching wings he had forgotten he possessed. Years later, when Botan had become a teacher, he would often tell the story of Haku the crane. "We all build comfortable enclosures," he would say. "Relationships that feel safe but limit growth. Jobs that provide security but prevent exploration. Routines that feel comforting but cage us. The bamboo walls look like protection, but they're actually prevention, preventing us from discovering what we're capable of, from attempting flights we were made for." Students would ask, "But how do we know when comfort has become a cage? When should we leave the enclosure?" "When you're walking the same paths day after day without growth," Botan would reply. "When you've stopped even looking at the sky. When you've forgotten you have wings. When the thought of flying fills you with fear rather than excitement. These are signs that comfort has become captivity, that the safe enclosure has become a prison you don't recognize as a prison because it's comfortable." He would pause, then add, "The tragedy isn't being in the enclosure. The tragedy is forgetting you can leave, forgetting you were made for flight, forgetting that your wings have purpose beyond stretching." Haku lived 3 years in comfortable captivity before someone reminded him he could fly. How many years will you live in yours before you remember? Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own bamboo enclosure. What comfortable cage have you built for yourself? What safe patterns have you established that prevent growth? What flights are you not attempting because staying grounded feels safer? You have wings. You've always had wings. The question isn't whether you're capable of flight. You are. The question is whether you've become so comfortable with the ground that you've forgotten that the sky is where you belong. Whether the bamboo enclosure feels so safe that you've stopped noticing it's still an enclosure. Rest tonight with this awareness. Tomorrow, you could fly. You could attempt something that terrifies you. You could leave the comfortable patterns and risk the unknown. You could stretch your wings, not just as exercise, but as preparation for actual flight. The cage isn't locked. It never was. You've just been comfortable enough that you forgot to try the door. Sleep now and dream of flying. Let some part of you remember what your wings are for. And when you wake, maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready to find out what happens when you actually use them. In a valley between 2 mountain ranges, there was a river that confused everyone who saw it. Most rivers in the region flowed from high elevations to low, following gravity as rivers should. But this river appeared to run uphill, flowing from what looked like lower ground to higher ground, defying logic and nature. Villagers argued about the river for generations. Some said it was cursed, that supernatural forces made it run backwards. Others insisted it was an optical illusion, that the river only appeared to run uphill but actually didn't. A few claimed the river was evidence of magic in the world, proof that natural laws could be suspended. A scholar named Fumiko came to study the peculiar river. She was a woman who trusted observation over superstition, who believed that understanding came from careful study rather than easy assumptions. She spent weeks walking the river's length, taking measurements, making careful notes. What she discovered was unexpected. The river wasn't running uphill at all, though it certainly appeared to be. The optical illusion was created by the unusual topology of the valley. The way surrounding hills created a visual context that made lower ground appear higher and higher ground appear lower. When you adjusted for this visual distortion and looked at actual elevations, the river was flowing downhill as it should, following gravity perfectly. But there was a second discovery, more interesting than the first. There was a short section where the river actually did flow uphill, pushed by an underground spring with such force that it created a brief reversal of normal flow before gravity took over again. This wasn't magic or curse, it was hydrology, underground pressure overcoming gravity temporarily, a natural phenomenon that looked miraculous only because people didn't understand the forces involved. Fumiko shared her findings with the villagers, explaining the optical illusion and the underground spring. Some villagers were relieved to have the mystery explained. Others were disappointed. They had preferred the magical explanation to the scientific one. But an old farmer named Gonji said something that made Fumiko reconsider what she thought she'd discovered. "The river teaches something important," Gonji said. "It teaches that things can look completely wrong while being completely right, that what appears to violate natural laws might just be responding to forces we don't understand yet." He pointed to his fields. "I plant crops that other farmers say won't grow in this soil. They say I'm working against nature, that I should plant what everyone plants. But I've learned that this soil has properties they don't understand, that what looks like wrong farming is actually right farming for these specific conditions." Fumiko thought about this. She had explained the river's apparent backwards flow, but Gonji was suggesting something deeper, that the river taught people to question their assumptions about what's natural, what's possible, what's right. The river looked wrong, but was responding perfectly to actual conditions, both the optical conditions that made flow appear backwards and the geological conditions that briefly pushed water uphill. "You're saying the river teaches us to look deeper before judging?" Fumiko asked. "More than that," Gonji replied. "It teaches us that backwards and forwards depend on what forces you're aware of. To someone who only knows gravity, water flowing uphill is impossible, wrong, against nature. But to someone who understands underground pressure, water flowing uphill is perfectly natural, a correct response to present forces." He gestured to the river. "How many things in life look wrong because we're only seeing some of the forces involved? How many people are judged for going against the flow when they're actually responding to forces others can't see?" Over the following months, Fumiko expanded her study. She began collecting stories of things that appeared to violate natural expectations, but actually didn't. They just responded to forces that weren't immediately obvious. A tree growing bent at a strange angle because of prevailing winds that had since died down. A flower blooming in winter because of an underground hot spring. A bird flying inland before storms because it sensed pressure changes humans couldn't detect. Each example taught the same lesson. What appears wrong might be responding perfectly to reality, while what appears right might be ignorant of important forces. A young mother came to Fumiko with a problem. My son won't follow the path I've set for him. He's going backwards from where he should go, against everything natural and right. How do I make him flow the right direction? Tell me about your son, Fumiko said. The mother described a boy who refused to take over the family business, who wanted instead to become a traveling musician. It's backwards, she insisted. Children should continue family work. That's the natural flow. He's going against nature. Or he's responding to forces you're not seeing, Fumiko suggested gently. Is he talented musically? Very, but that's not the point. Talent doesn't change duty. Doesn't it? Fumiko asked. The river appears to flow backwards because of forces beneath the surface. Perhaps your son is flowing in a direction that looks backwards to you, but is actually responding to forces inside him, talents, passions, purposes that you can't see or don't value. Just because his flow doesn't match your expectations doesn't mean it's wrong. She told the mother about the river, about how it appeared to defy nature, but actually followed it perfectly when all forces were considered. Your son might be like that river. What looks like backwards rebellion might be forward movement towards something he's meant to do. The question isn't whether he's flowing the way you expected, but whether he's flowing true to himself. This conversation troubled the mother, but she began to observe her son differently. She noticed how music seemed to flow from him naturally, how he came alive when playing, how his path, though different from hers, had its own rightness to it. Eventually, though it was difficult, she accepted that his backwards path might be his right path. Word spread about Fumiko's teachings about the backwards river. People began using it as a way to reconsider their own judgments. When someone's path looked wrong, they would ask, "Am I seeing all the forces involved? Or am I judging based on incomplete understanding?" A magistrate applied this thinking to a legal case. A man had broken a law, but when the magistrate investigated deeper, he found forces that explained the law-breaking in a way that changed the judgment entirely. The man wasn't defying order. He was responding to a greater order that the law itself hadn't anticipated. A teacher applied it to a student who learned differently from others. Instead of judging the student as backwards or wrong, the teacher looked for the forces, the different cognitive patterns, the unique intelligences that made the student's apparently backwards approach actually forward for him. Years later, Fumiko's study of the backwards river had become famous beyond the valley. She was invited to give lectures, to advise rulers, to teach scholars. But she always returned to the river itself, watching its apparently impossible flow, using it to remind herself that understanding requires humility, that what appears wrong might be right in ways she hasn't yet grasped. A visiting philosopher asked her, "But aren't some things actually wrong? Doesn't your river teaching lead to excusing everything, to saying nothing is really backwards because we just don't understand the forces?" "No," Fumiko replied carefully. "Some things are genuinely wrong. They're responding to destructive forces like cruelty or ignorance or selfishness. The river teaches discernment, not relativism. It teaches us to look for forces we might not see before judging, but after looking, we still make judgments. The difference is, our judgments are informed by deeper understanding, rather than surface appearance. She pointed to the river. This river looks backwards, but isn't. But if a farmer tried to make his irrigation flow uphill without underground spring pressure, that would be genuinely backwards, genuinely wrong. The teaching isn't that everything is right. The teaching is that apparent wrongness requires investigation before judgment. Some backwards flows are responding to forces we need to understand. Others are just backwards. Tonight, as you rest, you might reconsider things in your life that appear backwards or wrong. Your own path that doesn't match expectations. Other people's choices that confuse you. Circumstances that seem to violate how things should be. Before judging these as wrong, ask, what forces might I not be seeing? What underground pressures might be pushing flow in directions that look impossible, but are actually perfectly natural? The backwards river teaches humility in judgment, curiosity before conclusion, openness to forces you don't yet understand. Not everything that looks wrong is right, but some things that look wrong are responding to reality more accurately than things that look right. The only way to know is to look deeper, to consider forces beyond the obvious, to remain humble about the limits of your understanding. Rest now in acceptance of apparent backwards flows in yourself and others. Let the river run its course, responding to all the forces acting on it, both visible and hidden. Trust that what looks impossible might be possible, that what seems backwards might be forward, that nature is wiser than our quick judgments about what's natural. The river knows where it's going, even when it appears to go the wrong way. As our exploration of Zen Buddhism deepens, let us listen to a story that reveals how true worth is often overlooked. Here starts the next story. In a famous garden known for its roses, there appeared one season a strange mutation, a rosebush with no thorns. The stems were completely smooth, the flowers beautiful, but there was no defense, no sharp points to protect the plant from being damaged. The gardener, a woman named Ayame, was fascinated by this thornless rose. She thought it was perfect, an improvement over regular roses. Who wouldn't want roses without thorns? Roses that you could handle freely, cut without care, and arrange without risk of being pricked. She took cuttings from the thornless rose and propagated them, creating a whole section of the garden filled with these defenseless plants. She was so proud of this achievement that she invited people from across the region to see her thornless roses. But within a few months, problems appeared. Deer, which usually avoided the thorny roses, ate the thornless ones freely. Insects that were discouraged by thorns colonized these plants without resistance. Careless visitors would grab handfuls of flowers, taking far more than they would have if thorns had made them cautious. Within a year, the thornless roses were struggling. They required constant human protection, constant intervention, constant care in ways that regular roses never needed. What had seemed like an improvement turned out to be a vulnerability, a visiting botanist explained to Ayame. The thorns weren't a flaw in the design. They were part of the wisdom of the design. The rose needs protection because it's beautiful and therefore desirable. The thorns say, "Appreciate me from a respectful distance. If you want my beauty, approach carefully with awareness. Without that protection, the rose is too vulnerable to survive." Ayame was defensive at first, but thorns hurt people. Wouldn't it be better to have roses without danger? Danger isn't the only reason for boundaries, the botanist replied. The thorns create an appropriate relationship. They don't prevent you from enjoying the rose. They just require you to be careful, to pay attention, to approach with awareness rather than grabbing carelessly. The thornless rose invites carelessness, and carelessness destroys it. Ayame began to see the thornless roses differently. What she had thought was an improvement was actually a mutation that made the plant unable to protect itself. And that inability to protect itself meant the plant couldn't thrive. She noticed similar patterns in human behavior. People who had no boundaries, no ability to say no, no thorns to protect themselves, often ended up depleted and taken advantage of. Like her thornless roses, they needed constant intervention to survive because they couldn't protect themselves naturally. The thorns aren't cruel, she told visitors who still admired the thornless roses. They're wisdom. They're the rose's way of teaching appropriate relationships. Approach with care. Take only what's offered. Respect the boundary between appreciation and consumption. The thornless rose can't teach this lesson, so it gets consumed. She stopped propagating the thornless mutation and let those plants live out their natural lifespan while caring for them extra carefully. When they eventually died, she didn't replace them. Her garden returned to thorny roses that could protect themselves, that invited careful appreciation rather than careless grabbing. Tonight, you might consider your own thorns, the boundaries you felt guilty about, the protections you've thought were unfriendly or unkind, the ways you've learned to say no, to keep an appropriate distance, to require others to approach you with care rather than carelessness. These aren't flaws, they're wisdom. They're what allow you to survive and thrive. Don't apologize for your thorns. They're part of your design, protecting what's most beautiful about you from being carelessly destroyed. There was a master calligrapher named Kenzo who had spent 40 years perfecting his craft. He could write each character with flawless precision, every stroke exactly as the ancient masters had prescribed. His work was technically perfect, exhibited in galleries, and purchased by collectors who valued his adherence to classical standards. But Kenzo had a secret dissatisfaction. Despite the praise and recognition, his work felt lifeless to him. Each piece was an exercise in replication, a demonstration of technique, but nothing more. He was copying perfection that had been established centuries ago, adding nothing of himself, discovering nothing new. One day, an important patron commissioned a piece for a temple dedication. The character to be written was Mu, meaning emptiness or void. Kenzo prepared carefully, mixing his ink to exactly the right consistency, selecting his finest brush, and setting up his workspace with meticulous attention to every detail. He had practiced this character thousands of times. He knew exactly how it should look. He visualized every stroke in his mind, preparing to execute it perfectly. But as he positioned his brush above the paper, his cat, who normally slept quietly in the corner during his work, suddenly leapt onto the table. The cat's paw hit Kenzo's arm just as he was beginning the first stroke. The brush dragged across the paper in a completely unintended direction, creating a wild, irregular mark that bore no resemblance to proper calligraphy. Kenzo's first reaction was anger. The perfect paper was ruined. Hours of preparation wasted. He would have to start over, and he was already behind schedule. He grabbed the ruined piece, intending to crumple it and throw it away. But something made him pause. He looked at the mark more carefully. The stroke was wild, yes, completely improper by classical standards. But it had an energy, a life, a spontaneous quality that none of his careful, perfect strokes ever achieved. It looked like emptiness, like void, like the very essence of mu, in a way his technically correct versions never had. The mark captured something real about emptiness, its unpredictability, its resistance to control, its indifference to our intentions. His planned perfect versions had been illustrations of the concept. This accidental mark was somehow the thing itself. Kenzo sat staring at this mistake for over an hour. Finally, he decided to build the rest of the character around it, incorporating the wild stroke instead of starting over. The final piece was unlike anything he had ever created. It combined his technical skill with this element of pure accident, planned mastery with unplanned spontaneity. When he delivered the piece to his patron, he apologized. "I must confess, this isn't what I planned." My cat interfered, and the first stroke went completely wrong. I tried to salvage the piece, but it's not traditional calligraphy. I understand if you want me to create a new one. The patron studied the work in silence for a long time. Finally, he said, "This is the finest piece you've ever created." "But it's wrong," Kenzo protested. "The first stroke violates every principle of proper form." "It's alive," the patron replied. "Your other work is beautiful, technically flawless, but it's like looking at a preserved flower. This piece is like seeing a flower growing wild. It has breath in it, spontaneity, the quality of something happening right now rather than being carefully reconstructed from the past." He hung the piece in the temple, and people came from across the region to see it. Other calligraphers studied it, trying to understand how Kenzo had achieved such vitality. Some tried to recreate the effect by deliberately making mistakes, but these forced accidents never had the same quality. The life in Kenzo's piece came from the genuineness of the accident, not from calculated imperfection. A Zen master who viewed the piece said to Kenzo, "Your cat understood something you had forgotten, that true art comes from responding to the moment, not from executing a plan. For 40 years, you've been copying the past. In one moment of accident, you created something present." "But I can't plan accidents," Kenzo said. "I can't make this happen deliberately." "Exactly," the master replied. "That's why it worked. Your planning mind, your control, your perfection, all of that had to be interrupted for something real to emerge. The cat was your teacher." From that day forward, Kenzo's approach to calligraphy changed. He still practiced technique, still maintained his skills, but he stopped trying to control every aspect of the outcome. He began leaving space for accident, for the unexpected, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom. Sometimes he would start a piece without complete preparation, letting the consistency of the ink vary, allowing the paper to be slightly wrinkled, welcoming small imperfections. Sometimes he would work faster than was comfortable, not giving himself time to calculate every movement. Sometimes he would deliberately do something unusual, breaking a rule to see what would happen. Not every piece succeeded. Many experiments failed, but the successful pieces had a quality his earlier perfect work had lacked: presence, immediacy, life. They felt like they were happening rather than being displayed. They invited the viewer into an experience rather than presenting a completed achievement. Other calligraphers criticized this departure from classical standards. Kenzo has abandoned proper technique, they said. He's making mistakes deliberately. This isn't true calligraphy. But Kenzo understood something they didn't. Technique wasn't being abandoned. It was being liberated. He had spent 40 years building technical mastery. Now he was learning what to do with that mastery, not to control and perfect, but to create conditions where truth could emerge spontaneously. The technique serves spontaneity, he would tell students. You practice until the movements are natural, until you don't have to think about them. Then you let go of trying to be perfect and allow something real to happen. The years of practice give you the skills. The letting go gives you the art. One student asked, "But how do you know when to let go? How do you know when you've practiced enough?" "You don't," Kenzo admitted. "I practiced for 40 years before my cat taught me to let go. Maybe that was too long. Maybe it wasn't long enough. The point isn't reaching some perfect amount of preparation. The point is remaining open to the moment when control needs to give way to spontaneity." He showed the student his temple piece with its wild first stroke. "I could never recreate this exactly. I could make similar pieces, but this particular mark came from this particular moment of accident. That's what makes it true. It's not a reproducible technique. It's a response to what actually happened." Years later, when Kenzo was old, he was asked to demonstrate calligraphy for the emperor. It was considered a great honor. Most calligraphers prepared extensively for such occasions, practicing for weeks to ensure a perfect demonstration. Kenzo prepared differently. He practiced just enough to be warmed up, then went to the demonstration with no fixed plan. He would respond to the moment, to the energy in the room, to whatever impulse arose. It was terrifying and exhilarating. As he stood before the emperor with brush and paper, he felt all his years of perfect control wanting to take over. The safe thing would be to execute a flawless classical piece. But instead, he paused, breathed, and let go of control. What emerged was neither perfectly planned nor completely accidental. It was something in between, technique meeting moment, skill dancing with spontaneity, the practiced hand responding to the unpracticed impulse. The character he created had both mastery and wildness, both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the emperor was silent for a moment, then said, "I have seen many demonstrations of perfect technique. This is the first time I've seen calligraphy that felt alive. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where you're over-controlling, over-planning, and trying to perfect everything before you act. What would happen if you made space for accident, for spontaneity, for the moment to contribute its own wisdom? What if your careful plans are actually preventing something more true from emerging? The perfect mistake teaches that life isn't lived according to plan. The most authentic moments come when planning gives way to presence, when control releases into response, when the prepared hand meets the unprepared moment. You don't need to have everything figured out. You don't need perfect execution. You need technique in the service of spontaneity, skill as a foundation for letting go. Rest now in the space between planning and accident, between control and release. Let yourself be like Kenzo's brush, prepared by practice, but freed from the need to be perfect. Tomorrow might bring a cat leaping onto your carefully prepared plans. Let it. The interruption might be the teacher. The accident might be the truth. The mistake might be perfect. Continuing along the path of Zen insight, we pause now to hear a teaching about perception and hidden value. Listen carefully to the next story. In a mountain village famous for its textiles, there was a master weaver named Chio who created cloth of extraordinary beauty. Her patterns were intricate, her colors perfectly balanced, her technique flawless. People would travel for days to commission work from her loom, and her pieces hung in the homes of nobles throughout the province. Then, one winter morning, Chio woke to find her hands had stiffened with arthritis. The pain was intense, but worse was the loss of the fine motor control that her craft demanded. She could no longer work the shuttle with her usual precision. The delicate adjustments that created her signature patterns were now impossible. For a weaver, this seemed like a death sentence. Chio's entire identity, her life's work, her purpose, all depended on her hands. Now those hands betrayed her, refusing to do what she commanded. She sat before her loom for hours, weeping, unable to imagine a future without her craft. Days turned to weeks. The loom sat silent. Chio refused visitors, refused commissions, refused to even look at the beautiful threads that had once brought her such joy. Her apprentice, a young woman named Nao, came regularly, begging Chio to teach her, to at least pass on knowledge if she could no longer create. But Chio sent her away each time. "What's the point?" she would say. "Without my hands, I have nothing to teach. I am nothing." One day, Nao arrived with a request that Chio couldn't refuse. A small child from the village was sick, and his mother had asked if Chio might weave even a simple cloth for the child's comfort. "She doesn't expect your fine work," Nao said gently. "She just wants something made by you, even if it's rough. She believes your cloth has healing in it." Chio couldn't say no to a sick child, so she returned to her loom for the first time in months. Her stiff hands struggled with the shuttle. The tension was uneven. The pattern she attempted came out distorted. Everything her hands produced now was clumsy, imperfect, wrong. But she continued, driven by compassion for the child. She created a simple blanket, nothing like her former masterpieces. The weave was loose, the pattern irregular, the whole piece marked by the limitations of her arthritic hands. She wrapped it with shame, certain the mother would be disappointed. When Nao delivered the blanket, the mother held it and began to cry. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell Chio it's the most beautiful thing she's ever made." Nao brought this message back to Chio, who couldn't believe it. How could that rough, imperfect work be beautiful? "It's everything I spent my life learning not to create." The mother said she could feel the struggle in it, Nao reported. She said she could feel your hands fighting to create something despite the pain. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can emerge from difficulty, that limitation doesn't mean the end of creation. Her child is struggling too, and she said this cloth would remind him that struggle can still produce beauty. This response shook something loose in Chio's understanding. She had thought beauty required perfection, that her arthritic hands could only produce inferior work. But this mother had seen a different kind of beauty, the beauty of creation despite limitation, of persistence through difficulty, of love expressed through imperfect means. Chio returned to her loom with a new perspective. She stopped trying to create what her hands could no longer produce and started exploring what they could produce. The patterns that emerged were unlike anything she had made before. They were asymmetrical, organic, and marked by the randomness of her unpredictable hand movements. They told stories of struggle and adaptation, of beauty that included, rather than denied, imperfection. People noticed something profound in this new work. Her earlier pieces had been technically superior, but these new pieces touched something deeper. They were relatable in a way perfection never is. They spoke of being human, of limitations, of finding beauty not despite obstacles, but through them. "Your old work was impressive," one patron told her. "This new work is moving. I look at your perfect pieces and admire them. I look at these new pieces and feel understood." Chio began teaching again, but with a transformed philosophy. "I spent 30 years pursuing perfection," she would tell students. "I thought my value as a weaver came from my technical mastery. But arthritis stripped that away and showed me something more important. That beauty doesn't require perfection. That limitation can reveal new possibilities. That the work of imperfect hands can touch hearts in ways that perfect technique never could." She would show students her early work alongside her later work. "These first pieces show what skilled hands can do. These later pieces show what love can do with whatever hands you have. Which is more valuable?" The answer isn't obvious. Now, who had continued as her apprentice through all these changes, asked one day, "Do you wish you could have your old hands back? Do you miss being able to create perfectly?" Chio thought for a long time before answering. "I miss the ease of it," she said honestly. "I miss not feeling pain with every movement, but I don't miss who I was when perfection came easily." That Chio was skilled but narrow. She understood only one kind of beauty. This Chio, with her stiff, painful hands, understands more. The arthritis took my technical perfection, but it gave me depth I never had before. She held up her gnarled hands. "These hands taught me what my young, nimble hands never could, that obstacles refine what truly matters. When I could create anything, I created what was impressive. Now that I can only create with difficulty, I create what's true." The limitation stripped away everything superficial and left only what's essential. Years passed, and Chio's hands grew worse. Eventually, she could barely work the loom at all. But by then, her teaching had become as valued as her weaving once was. She taught people to see obstacles not as endings, but as refinements, not as barriers, but as editors that remove what's unnecessary and reveal what's essential. "Every limitation is a teacher," she would say. "It shows you what really matters by taking away what doesn't." My hands took away my technical mastery and revealed that mastery was never the point. The point was always connection, expression, and the creation of beauty that touches hearts. I can do that with arthritic hands. I just had to learn a different language of beauty. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider your own limitations, your own obstacles, your own arthritic hands. What has been taken from you that felt essential? What can you no longer do that once defined you? These losses aren't just subtractions, they're refinements, removing what's superficial to reveal what's essential. Your obstacles are teaching you something. They're stripping away the easy answers, the impressive exteriors, the technical perfections that never touched anyone's heart anyway. What remains, what you can still do despite your limitations, that's what truly matters. That's where your real beauty lives. Rest now in acceptance of your arthritic hands, your imperfect instruments, your limited capacities. They're not preventing beauty. They're refining it, teaching it, revealing it in forms you never would have discovered through ease and perfection. The weaver's silent loom eventually spoke with more power than her perfect one ever did. Your limitations will teach you the same truth if you let them. As we drift deeper into the still waters of Zen, a quiet teaching begins to rise, one that speaks of clarity and of value not always seen. Listen gently now. The next story begins. In the capital city lived a tea master named Soho, who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of the tea ceremony. His movements were flawless, his timing exact, his aesthetic sense refined beyond what most people could achieve in several lifetimes. Every detail of his ceremonies was considered and precise. The angle of the bowl, the temperature of the water, the moment to pass the tea, the positioning of each implement. Soho's ceremonies were legendary. People would wait years for an invitation to attend. Wealthy patrons offered fortunes to have Soho perform ceremonies for their guests. Other tea masters studied his techniques, trying to replicate his perfection. But Soho himself had grown troubled. Despite his technical mastery, despite the acclaim, he felt his ceremonies had become performances rather than genuine expressions of tea mind. He was so focused on executing each movement perfectly that he had lost connection to the spirit beneath the movements. His ceremonies were flawless, but somehow empty. On his 70th birthday, Soho decided to retire from public ceremonies. He would perform one final tea ceremony, a farewell to his long career, and then step away to live simply in a small temple. He prepared meticulously for this final ceremony. He invited only his closest students and a few respected elders who had followed his work for decades. He selected implements he had used for years, choosing each for its history and meaning. He practiced the movements daily in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, ensuring everything would be perfect. The day of the ceremony arrived. Soho entered the tea room with his usual grace, began with his usual precision. His guests watched in respectful silence, knowing they were witnessing a master's final performance. Then, midway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened. As Soho reached for the tea bowl, his hand trembled slightly. Whether from age, emotion, or simple nervousness, he couldn't say. The tremor caused him to fumble the bowl. It didn't fall or break, but his grip was clumsy, his movement awkward. The flow of the ceremony was disrupted by this imperfect moment. Soho's first instinct was mortification. After 50 years of perfect execution, his final ceremony was marred by a clumsy mistake. But then something shifted in him. The mistake had broken his focus on perfection, and in that break, he suddenly felt present in a way he hadn't been during a ceremony in years. He picked up the bowl, not with perfect grace, but with simple honesty, with the actual movement of an old man holding a bowl. He continued the ceremony, but something had changed. He was no longer performing perfectly. He was just making tea, sharing tea, being present with his guests. The movements that followed weren't as technically flawless as usual, but they had a quality his perfect performances had lacked. They were real. They were Soho actually being here, making tea, connecting with his guests, rather than Soho executing a perfect reproduction of the tea master role. When the ceremony ended, there was a long silence. Then one of the elder guests spoke. "That was the finest tea ceremony I have ever experienced." Soho was confused. "But I made mistakes. The execution wasn't clean." "The execution was finally clean," the elder replied. "Clean of performance, clean of ego, clean of the need to be perfect. For the first time in decades, I saw you actually making tea rather than demonstrating how tea should be made. Your fumble was the most important moment of the ceremony. It dropped you out of performance and into presence." Another guest agreed. "I've attended 6 of your ceremonies over the years. They were all technically superior to today's. But this one touched me in a way the others never did. The imperfection made it human. It made it real. It made it about tea rather than about perfection." Soho sat with this feedback for a long time. He realized that his 50-year pursuit of perfect execution had taken him away from genuine expression. He had become so skilled at performing the tea ceremony that he had forgotten how to simply make tea with presence and care. "I thought mastery meant perfect execution," Soho told his students later. "I thought the goal was to perform each movement so exactly that no flaw could be found. But that kind of mastery is dead. It's impressive but not alive. Today, when I fumbled and had to let go of perfection, I finally rediscovered what tea ceremony is actually about. Presence, connection, the simple act of sharing tea with other humans." He looked at his hands, still slightly trembling. "These old hands that made a mistake taught me more than 50 years of perfect practice. They taught me that perfect execution becomes perfect only when you stop trying to perfect it, when you let go of performance and sink into presence." One student asked, "So should we not practice? Should we not work toward technical excellence?" "Practice," Soho replied. "Develop your technique. But don't let technique become an end in itself. Practice until the movements are natural, then let go of trying to perform them perfectly. Use your technique to support presence, not to replace it. Master the form so completely that you can forget the form and just be here, making tea." He picked up a tea bowl, holding it with the same slight tremble. "See this imperfection? This is actually perfection because it's real. It's an old man's hand actually holding a bowl. The steady, flawless grip I cultivated for decades was impressive, but it was also a kind of lie it hid my actual hand behind a perfect performance. This trembling hand is honest, and honesty is more important than perfection." In the weeks following his final ceremony, Soho began making tea in a completely different way. He still had all his technical skills, all his aesthetic sensitivity, but he used them lightly, allowing imperfection, welcoming the unexpected, staying present with what was actually happening rather than executing a mental script. He made tea for strangers, for children, for anyone who wanted to share a bowl. These weren't formal ceremonies with guests and perfect settings. They were just tea, made with care, shared with presence. and people felt more touched by these simple offerings than they had by his legendary perfect ceremonies. "You've become a greater tea master by letting go of mastery," one visitor observed. "I've become an actual tea master by letting go of the performance of mastery," Soho clarified. "I was skilled before, but I wasn't real. Now I'm both skilled and real. The skill supports the reality rather than replacing it. That's the difference." A young tea student struggling to perfect his own technique asked Soho for guidance. "How do I know when my practice is good enough? When can I stop trying to perfect my movements? When perfection becomes a barrier rather than a path," Soho replied. "Practice until the movements are natural and trustworthy. Then let go of trying to make them perfect and just let them be. The movement from practice to performance to presence, that's the journey. Most people stop at performance, endlessly perfecting their execution. The final step is letting go of perfection and discovering presence." He made tea for the young student, his hands moving with practiced skill, but also with slight tremors, small imperfections, human reality. "See how I make tea now? I'm not performing or demonstrating, I'm just making tea. The years of practice allow me to do it well, but letting go of perfection allows me to do it truly. Both are necessary, but the second is what makes it complete. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what you've been perfecting, performing, trying to execute flawlessly. What would happen if you let your hands tremble slightly? If you allowed imperfection? If you stopped performing mastery and just did the thing itself, present and real? Perfect execution is impressive, but presence is what actually connects, what actually matters, what actually makes any practice complete. You've practiced enough. You've refined enough. Now it's time to let go of perfection and discover what's on the other side. Not sloppiness, not carelessness, but genuine presence that includes both skill and imperfection, both mastery and humanity. Rest now in this completion. Let yourself fumble slightly. Let yourself be real rather than perfect. The Tea Master's Last Cup teaches that the journey ends not in flawless execution, but in authentic presence. You've arrived, not at perfection, but at something better, yourself, skilled and real, doing what you do with care and presence, and the slight tremble of actual human hands. That's perfection. That's the completion. That's the teaching. Sleep now, no longer performing, just being. This is enough. You are enough. The perfect becomes perfect when you stop trying to perfect it. In a city famous for its artists, there was a renowned sculptor named Kaori who had created magnificent works for temples, palaces, and public squares throughout the land. She was known for her perfectionism, her unwillingness to declare any work complete until every detail was exactly right. At age 60, Kaori received a commission that she knew would be her masterpiece, a memorial sculpture for the city's founder. She had complete artistic freedom and unlimited time. This would be her legacy, the work by which all her other work would be judged. She began with intense focus, creating preliminary sketches, building models, and selecting the perfect stone. The first year was spent in planning. The second year is spent roughing out the basic form. By the third year, the sculpture was recognizably taking shape as a figure of dignity and strength, capturing something essential about leadership and vision. But as the sculpture neared completion, something strange happened. Kaori couldn't finish it. Every time she thought she was done, she would see another adjustment to make, another detail to refine, another element that wasn't quite right. The nose could be more precise, the hands could be more expressive, the drapery could flow more naturally. Years passed. The sculpture stood in her studio, nearly complete, but never quite complete enough. City officials would visit, would ask when they might see the finished work, and Kaori would assure them it was almost ready, just a few more refinements needed. 10 years after beginning the project, Kaori was still working on the same sculpture. It had gone through countless iterations. Areas she had refined years earlier, she would redo, claiming her skills had improved, and she could do better now. The sculpture had become an obsession, a project that consumed her life but never reached completion. A young sculptor named Isamu, who admired Kaori's earlier work, came to apprentice with her. He expected to learn from watching a master complete her masterpiece. Instead, he found an old woman trapped in endless refinement, unable to stop working on a sculpture that had been nearly done for years. "Why don't you declare it finished?" Isamu finally asked, after watching Kaori rework the same hand for the third time since he arrived. "Because it's not perfect yet," Kaori replied. "I can see the ideal form in my mind. This stone version still falls short. I need to keep working until the stone matches the vision." "But will it ever match?" Isamu asked gently. "Will the real sculpture ever match the perfect one in your imagination?" Kaori had no answer. She had never asked herself this question. She had always assumed that with enough work, enough refinement, enough time, she could make the physical sculpture match her mental ideal. A Zen teacher named Etsuko, who had known Kaori for decades, visited the studio. She looked at the nearly complete sculpture with a sad expression. "You're destroying it," Etsuko said. "I'm perfecting it," Kaori protested. "No, you're overworking it. The sculpture lost its life years ago when you couldn't stop refining it. Now it's becoming tight, over-controlled, anxious. I can see your perfectionism in every surface. The early spontaneity is gone, replaced by compulsive detail." She touched the sculpture gently. Completion doesn't mean achieving perfection. It means recognizing when continuing diminishes rather than improves. This sculpture was probably finished 5 years ago, but you couldn't see it because you were comparing it to an impossible ideal rather than accepting it as the real thing it actually was. Kaori wanted to argue, but she knew Etsuko was right. She looked at her sculpture with honest eyes for the first time in years. It was beautiful in parts, overworked in others. The areas she had refined most recently were actually worse than earlier versions. Too controlled, too fussy, too perfect. The sculpture had lost its breath somewhere along the way. "How do I know when something is done?" Kaori asked quietly. "How do I distinguish between stopping because it's complete and stopping because I've given up?" "You feel it," Etsuko replied. "True completion has a quality of rightness, even if the work isn't perfect. Giving up has a quality of defeat. But what you're doing now is neither completion nor giving up. It's compulsive continuation, working past the point where work helps. That's different from both completion and abandonment." She looked at Kaori directly. The sculpture should have been installed in the city square years ago, where people would appreciate it. Instead, it's trapped in your studio. being endlessly refined toward an ideal it will never reach. You're preventing it from serving its purpose because you can't accept that it's good enough. That's not dedication to excellence. That's fear disguised as perfectionism. This truth landed hard. Kaori realized she had been afraid to finish the sculpture, afraid to have it judged, afraid it wouldn't live up to her reputation. As long as it remained unfinished in her studio, it remained perfect in potential. Once completed and installed, it would be real, subject to criticism, limited by its actual qualities rather than protected by its imagined ones. "I've been hiding," Kaori admitted, calling it refinement when actually it was avoidance. With Etsuko's help, Kaori looked at the sculpture one more time and made a decision. She declared it complete as it was, not perfect, but real. She stopped working on it and arranged for its installation. When the sculpture was finally revealed in the city square, public response was mixed. Some people loved it. Others thought it was good, but not as exceptional as they'd expected from a decade of work. Critics noted both its strengths and its weaknesses. It was not a perfect masterpiece. It was a good sculpture with both beautiful passages and overworked areas, a real work rather than an ideal one. And Kaori found unexpected peace in this. The sculpture was done, installed, serving its purpose. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. It had moved from endless potential to limited actuality, and this movement was itself a kind of perfection. Not the perfection of flawless execution, but the perfection of genuine completion. "I spent 10 years trying to make it perfect," Kaori told Isamu, standing together, looking at the installed sculpture. "I should have spent 3 years making it good, and then accepted that good was enough. The extra 7 years didn't make it better, they just delayed it." Isamu asked, "But how will you know with your next work? How will you know when to stop?" "I'll try to recognize when I'm working from love versus working from fear," Kaori said. "When I'm working from love, I'm responding to the actual piece, helping it become itself. When I'm working from fear, I'm trying to make it match an impossible ideal, trying to protect myself from criticism or judgment. The work from fear doesn't improve the piece. It just makes it tighter, more controlled, more dead." She touched a rough area of the sculpture that she had always intended to smooth further. "See this? For years I planned to refine it, but now I see it gives texture, life, contrast. My perfectionism wanted to eliminate it, but actually it's one of the better parts. Sometimes what we think is incomplete is actually just real, and real includes roughness, includes elements that don't match the ideal." In her remaining years, Kaori created several more sculptures, and each one she completed more quickly than the last. She learned to recognize the moment when a work was done, not perfect, but complete. She learned that completion meant allowing the work to be what it actually was, rather than endlessly pushing it toward what it might ideally be. "My final work taught me that sometimes completion means stopping, not finishing," she told students. "Sometimes good enough is actually excellent, because continuing would diminish rather than improve. Sometimes the work is done when you can let it go, not when it's perfect." Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what in your life needs completion rather than more refinement. What projects, relationships, phases, identities have you been endlessly working on, unable to declare them finished because they don't match your ideal? What would it mean to accept them as complete, as good enough, as done? Completion doesn't require perfection. It requires recognition that continuing is no longer serving the work or serving you. It requires courage to let the real thing exist, rather than protecting the imagined perfect thing by keeping it perpetually incomplete. Rest now in completion. Let yourself be done with some things, not because they're perfect, but because they're finished. Let yourself stop refining and start living with what actually is, rather than what might ideally be. The sculptor's final work teaches that holding on too long destroys as surely as letting go too early. Learn to recognize the difference, and then, when it's time, let go. With each breath, we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen, where the smallest stone may hold the greatest truth. Here starts the next story. In a coastal city, there lived a renowned mapmaker named Genji, who had charted more territory than any cartographer of his generation. His maps were detailed, accurate, and highly sought after by merchants, explorers, and military leaders. Every island, every coastline, every mountain range he documented was rendered with precision. But Genji had a practice that other mapmakers mocked. Whenever his knowledge ended, whenever he reached the limits of what had been explored and documented, he would leave the map blank. Large white spaces appeared on his charts, marked only with the words "unknown territory," or sometimes just left empty. Other mapmakers found this approach unprofessional. They would fill in the blank spaces with speculation, with reports from unreliable sources, with educated guesses. A map should be complete, they would argue. Blank spaces make it look unfinished. Blank spaces are honest, Genji would reply. They tell the truth, that we don't know what's there. Filling them with guesses tells a lie, that we do know. But the criticism stung, especially when clients would choose other mapmakers' complete maps over Genji's honest but incomplete ones. People wanted certainty, even false certainty. They wanted maps that told them what lay everywhere, even if those maps were partly fiction. One season, a wealthy merchant named Ichiro commissioned Genji to create a map for a trading expedition to distant islands. When Genji delivered the map, Ichiro was dismayed by the large blank areas. "What am I supposed to do with this?" Ichiro complained. "I need to know what's in these blank spaces. I need to plan my route." "What's in those spaces is unknown," Genji replied. "No reliable expedition has charted them. I can't tell you what I don't know." "But other mapmakers have filled in these areas," Ichiro protested. "They show islands, harbors, channels." "Based on speculation," Genji said. "Based on second-hand rumors and wishful thinking. If you sail using those maps, you'll be navigating by fantasy. My blank spaces at least tell you where certainty ends." Ichiro hired a different map maker who provided a complete map with no blank spaces. The expedition set sail using this fully detailed chart, confident in their route. 3 months later, the expedition returned, having lost 2 ships. They had found islands where the map showed open ocean, encountered reefs where the map showed safe passage, and wasted weeks exploring channels that didn't exist. The complete map had been worse than useless. It had been dangerous. Ichiro returned to Genji, chastened. "Your blank spaces would have saved lives. If I had known we were entering unknown territory, I would have proceeded cautiously. Instead, I trusted a map that pretended to know, and that false certainty led to disaster. Blank spaces scare people, Genji acknowledged. They remind us how much we don't know, how limited our understanding is. But pretending we know more than we do is worse than admitting our ignorance. The blank space says, be careful here, proceed thoughtfully, don't assume. The falsely filled space says, it's safe to trust this, which is a dangerous lie. Word spread about Ichiro's disaster and Genji's honest maps. More clients began to value the blank spaces, recognizing them as marks of integrity rather than incompleteness. They learned to read Genji's maps differently. The detailed areas showed where knowledge was reliable. The blank areas showed where caution was needed. A young apprentice named Lin came to study with Genji. She had been trained by other map makers who filled in all spaces, and she struggled with Genji's insistence on leaving blanks. But we can make educated guesses, Lin argued. We know the general geography of the region. We can estimate where islands are likely to be. And we'd be wrong half the time, Genji replied. An educated guess isn't knowledge. It's speculation with a fancy name. If you mark speculation as if it's fact, you're lying to whoever uses your map. He spread out several maps on his table, his own with its blank spaces, and competitors' maps of the same regions with every space filled. These complete maps look more professional, more finished. But which is more honest? Which better serves someone trusting their life to the information? Lin began to understand, but still she resisted. People don't want to be told we don't know. They want answers, even imperfect ones. Then they want comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths, Genji said. And it's not our job to provide comforting lies. Our job is to chart what's known and clearly mark what's not. The blank space is information. It tells you something important. Here be dragons, or at least here be unknowns. Proceed carefully. Over time, Lin learned to value the blank spaces. She discovered that leaving areas blank required as much skill as filling them in. You had to know exactly where certainty ended, had to resist the temptation to extend your knowledge beyond its actual limits, and had to be comfortable with admitting you didn't have all the answers. One day, an explorer returned from a region Genji had left blank on his maps. The explorer had detailed charts of what was actually there. Your blank space wasn't really blank, the explorer said, showing Genji islands and coastlines that had been unknown before. Now it's not blank, Genji agreed, carefully adding the new information to his map. But it was blank until you explored it. That's how honest maps work. They grow as knowledge grows, but they never pretend to knowledge we don't have. He looked at the transformed map. See how the blank space has been replaced with detail. That's how it should happen. First honest acknowledgement of ignorance, then actual exploration, then knowledge replacing the unknown. But some map makers skip the first step and go straight to filling in spaces with imagination, which prevents anyone from recognizing what actually needs to be explored. Years later, Genji's blank spaces became the very thing that made his maps valuable. Explorers would deliberately seek out the blank spaces on Genji's maps, knowing these marked genuinely unexplored territory rather than cartographic guesswork. Military leaders trusted Genji's maps precisely because they showed where trust should end. A historian interviewing Genji late in his life asked, "Don't the blank spaces bother you? Don't you wish you could fill in all the unknown areas before you die?" "No," Genji replied without hesitation. "The blank spaces are the most honest things on my maps. They say, 'I don't know,' which is often the truest thing a person can say. I could fill them with speculation and fantasy, making maps that look complete. But I'd rather make true maps." He gestured to his life's work, hundreds of maps, all marked with careful detail where knowledge existed and honest blankness where it didn't. These blank spaces are my legacy. They're me admitting the limits of my knowledge, refusing to pretend omniscience, valuing truth over completeness. Every mapmaker who fills in the unknown with guesses is choosing ego over integrity. I choose integrity. The historian looked at a particularly large blank space on one map. "Will this ever be filled in?" "Perhaps," Genji said. "Perhaps someone will explore that region and bring back reliable information, or perhaps it will remain blank forever. Either way, my map is honest right now, which is all any map can be." The map maker who fills in that space with speculation is making a map that's dishonest right now, in the hope that by accident he might be correct later. That's not map making. That's gambling. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider the blank spaces in your own understanding. Where are you filling in unknowns with speculation, pretending certainty you don't have, telling yourself and others you know things you actually don't? What would it mean to leave those spaces blank, to honestly mark them as unknown? The blank space isn't a failure. It's honesty. It's saying, "I don't know," instead of offering false certainty. It's admitting the limits of your understanding rather than pretending those limits don't exist. This feels vulnerable because we're taught that certainty is strength and uncertainty is weakness. But actually, false certainty is weakness disguised as strength, while honest uncertainty is strength willing to show itself. Rest now in your blank spaces. Let yourself not know what you don't know. Let yourself mark large areas of your life, your future, your understanding as unknown territory. This isn't an admission of failure, it's commitment to truth. The mapmaker with blank spaces serves better than the one with false completeness. So do you. Your honest "I don't know" is more valuable than anyone's false "I'm certain." Sleep in the blank spaces tonight where truth lives. The path of Zen unfolds like morning mist, soft and patient. In this next tale, we are invited to see, beyond appearance, into essence. Listen carefully to the next story. In a village where everyone prided themselves on their sophistication and education, there lived a simple man named Saburo who worked as a night watchman. His job was to walk through the streets after dark, making sure all was well, that no fires had started, that no trouble was brewing. Saburo had little education. He couldn't read the classical texts that the village scholars discussed. He didn't understand philosophy or poetry. The educated people of the village looked down on him somewhat, considering him simple, perhaps even slow-witted. But Saburo had one practice that brought him deep joy. On his nightly rounds, whenever he found a puddle that reflected the moon, he would stop and gaze at it. He would crouch down beside these puddles and smile at the perfect circle of light floating in the water. No matter how small or muddy, the puddle was. One night, a scholar named Masato was walking home late from a dinner party where there had been much wine and intellectual discussion. He came upon Saburo crouching beside a small puddle, staring into it with a look of wonder. "Saburo!" Masato called out, his words slightly slurred. "What are you doing down there in the mud?" "Looking at the moon," Saburo replied, not taking his eyes from the puddle. Masato laughed. "That's not the moon, you fool. That's just a reflection. The real moon is up there." He pointed to the sky, where the full moon hung bright and distant. "I know," Saburo said simply, "but I can't touch the real moon. It's too far away. This moon in the puddle, I can see it up close. I can watch it shimmer when the wind blows. I can see clouds pass across it. It's right here with me." "But it's not real," Masato insisted. "It's just an image, a copy. Why waste time looking at a reflection when you could look at the actual moon?" Saburo finally looked up at Masato. "I look at both. The moon in the sky is beautiful, but the moon in the puddle is beautiful too. And this one, I can be close to. This one shares the street with me. Why should I ignore it just because it's a reflection?" Masato shook his head and walked away, chuckling at the simple watchman's foolishness. But a traveling Zen monk had overheard this exchange. He approached Saburo and sat down beside the puddle. "May I look at the moon with you?" the monk asked. Saburo smiled and moved over to make room. Together, they gazed at the reflection in the puddle. After a while, the monk said, "That scholar thinks you're simple. He thinks you don't understand the difference between the real moon and its reflection." "I understand the difference," Saburo said quietly. "I just don't think it matters as much as he does." "Tell me what you mean," the monk said. Saburo thought for a moment, then spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "The scholar says the moon in the puddle isn't real. But I'm seeing it right now. It's making light in the water. It's changing as I watch it. How is that not real? Maybe it's not the same as the moon in the sky, but it's not nothing. It's something. And that something brings me joy." The monk nodded, saying nothing, encouraging Saburo to continue. People like Masato think some experiences are real and important, and other experiences are just reflections, just copies, not worth their time. But I don't see it that way. When I see beauty in a puddle, I'm really seeing it. When I feel peace looking at the moon's reflection, I'm really feeling it. Just because it's a reflection doesn't make my experience less real." The monk smiled broadly. "You understand something that the scholar doesn't. He's so concerned with distinguishing between original and copy, between real and reflected, that he misses the truth. All experience is real experience, even if it's experience of a reflection. The joy you feel looking at this puddle moon is not reflected. It's actual joy." They sat together in silence for a while longer. Then the monk said, "There's a teaching in Zen about the moon and its reflection. It says that trying to grasp the absolute truth is like trying to grab the moon in the sky. But seeing truth in everyday life is like seeing the moon reflected in water. We can't touch the infinite directly, but we experience it through its reflections in ordinary moments. You've understood this naturally, without studying." Saburo looked puzzled. I don't know about truth or the infinite. I just like looking at the moon in puddles." "That's exactly what I mean," the monk laughed. "The scholar knows many teachings but understands little. You know no teachings but understand much." Word of this conversation spread through the village. Some people thought it was just another example of Saburo's simplicity being mistaken for wisdom. But others began to think differently about reflections. A woman who had been dismissing her own life as less important than the lives of famous people she read about, realized that her experience of love, loss, joy, and sorrow was not a lesser version of human experience. It was human experience itself. The fact that no one wrote books about her life didn't make her life less real. A man who had been ashamed of his humble work, comparing it constantly to the prestigious careers of others, recognized that his satisfaction in work well done was not a reflected satisfaction. It was real satisfaction, no less valuable for coming from ordinary labor than satisfaction from celebrated achievement. A child who loved to draw but was told her art was just copying the real world, understood suddenly that her experience of creating was real creating, even if she was working from life rather than pure imagination. The monk stayed in the village for several weeks, and people noticed that he would often walk with Saburo on his night rounds. They would stop at puddles together, looking at reflections of the moon, stars, and lantern light. The educated people found this baffling. Why would a learned monk waste time with a simple watchman looking at puddles? But others began to join them. At first, just one or two, then more. They would walk the night streets, stopping at puddles, looking at reflected light, experiencing the strange beauty of seeing the distant brought near, the vast captured in the small. One night, Masato the scholar, humbled by wine, or perhaps by something else, joined the group. He crouched beside a puddle and looked at the moon's reflection. At first, all he could think was, "This isn't the real moon." But gradually, as he watched, something shifted. He stopped comparing the reflection to the original and simply experienced what was before him. Light in water, movement and shimmer, beauty is accessible and close. He found, to his surprise, that he was moved, not by the moon itself, which he had seen countless times, but by this moment of looking at light in a puddle, surrounded by others who were also looking, all of them sharing this simple, real experience. "I understand now," he said quietly to Saburo. "I've been so busy distinguishing between real and reflected that I forgot that all of it is real. The moon in the sky is real. The moon in the puddle is real. And my experience of looking at either one is real. Nothing is lesser just because it's a reflection." Saburo smiled. "The puddle moon is closer. I like that about it." Years later, when travelers asked what was special about this village, people would tell them about the night walks, the puddle gazing, the practice of seeing reflections not as inferior copies, but as real encounters with beauty brought near. And they would tell them about Saburo, the watchman who taught a village full of educated people, that reflection is not the opposite of reality. Reflection is reality in another form. Experience is experience, whether of original or copy, source or reflection. The joy is real. The beauty is real. The moment is real. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider what experiences you've been dismissing as just reflections. What joys have you minimized because they weren't the real thing? What beauty have you ignored because it came to you secondhand, through a screen, through a retelling, through some medium other than direct contact? All experience is real experience. The peace you feel listening to these words is not reflected peace, it's actual peace. The rest you're settling into is not a copy of rest, it's real rest. You don't have to touch the moon directly to experience moonlight. You don't have to live someone else's life to experience real life. Your experience right now, reflection or not, is completely real. Rest in the truth that this moment, this breath, this experience of being here is not practice for the real thing. It is the real thing. Nothing is lacking. Nothing needs to be more direct or more authentic. This is it. In this reflection, you call your life your actual life. These reflections, you call your experiences, are your actual experiences. And they are enough, more than enough. They are real. There was a devoted student named Akiko who studied with a Zen master for many years. She took meticulous notes on every teaching, every conversation, every insight that arose during her practice. Her room was filled with journals and scrolls, a massive accumulation of written wisdom that she treasured as proof of her learning. She would often review her notes, rereading old insights, checking her understanding against what she had written. The notes gave her a sense of security, a feeling that she was capturing and keeping the teachings, making sure nothing was lost. One day, her master, a woman named Mumon, came to Akiko's room and looked at the mountains of notes with a frown. "What is all this?" "My notes," Akiko said proudly. "Everything you've taught me over 5 years. Every koan we've discussed. Every meditation instruction. All preserved here." "Preserved?" Mumon repeated thoughtfully. "Like pickled vegetables?" Akiko laughed at the comparison. "Something like that. So I can return to these teachings whenever I need them." "Show me your understanding of the teaching we discussed yesterday," Mumon said. Akiko reached for her most recent journal and began reading her notes. Mumon stopped her. "Not what you wrote. Your understanding, without the notes." Akiko tried to explain the teaching from memory, but found she couldn't. Her mind kept trying to recall what she had written, rather than expressing what she actually understood. The notes had become a barrier between her and direct understanding. "You've been writing instead of learning," Mumon said gently. "You've been preserving teachings on paper rather than absorbing them into your being. You have accumulated much, but understood little." Akiko felt defensive. "But these notes help me remember. Without them, I would forget." "What you forget wasn't truly learned," Mumon replied. "And what you truly learn doesn't need notes to remember. Knowledge that lives only on paper is dead knowledge. It has to live in you to be real knowledge." She picked up one of Akiko's journals and read a passage about meditation. "Do you remember writing this?" "Yes, from 3 years ago. You were teaching about working with a restless mind." "And do you work with a restless mind this way?" Mumon asked. Akiko realized she didn't. She had written the teaching down, but never actually integrated it into her practice. The notes gave her the illusion of learning without the reality of it. Mumon set down the journal. "Tonight, I want you to burn all these notes." "What?" "No. These represent years of work. These represent years of writing. That's not the same as years of learning. Burn them. If the teachings took root in you, they'll survive the burning. If they didn't, then keeping the notes is just a way of avoiding that truth. Akiko spent a sleepless night agonizing over this instruction. Her notes felt like treasures, like her spiritual wealth accumulated over the years. But she trusted Mumon, so the next evening she built a fire and with trembling hands began feeding her journals to the flames. As each notebook burned, she felt panic and loss, years of writing disappearing into smoke and ash. But she continued, page by page, until everything was gone. She sat looking at the ashes, feeling empty and devastated. The next morning, Mumon asked her to explain a teaching from 2 years ago. Without her notes to consult, Akiko had to reach for what she actually remembered, what had actually integrated into her understanding. She was surprised to find that she could explain the teaching, not in the exact words she had written, but in her own words that expressed real understanding. "You see," Mumon said, "what truly became part of you survived the burning. What was only on paper is gone, but it was already gone in the sense that it wasn't really yours. You possessed the notes, but you didn't possess the understanding they were meant to point toward." Over the following weeks, something shifted in Akiko's learning. Without notes to rely on, she had to actually integrate teachings as they came. She had to pay a different kind of attention, not the attention of someone recording for later, but the attention of someone learning for now. She discovered that taking notes had been a way of deferring understanding. "I'll write this down and understand it later," she would think. But later never came. The act of writing created the illusion of learning while allowing actual learning to be postponed indefinitely. Now, without that crutch, she had to understand immediately. She had to ask questions in the moment rather than writing down words to puzzle over later. She had to practice teachings directly rather than preserving them for future practice. Her understanding deepened rapidly. The teachings weren't sitting on paper waiting to be reviewed. They were living in her actions, her responses, her way of being in the world. "Why did you have me burn the notes?" Akiko asked Mumon one day. "Was it to punish me for relying on them?" "Not punishment," Mumon replied. "Liberation. You were carrying a library but not living the teachings. The notes made you feel like a good student, like you were capturing and preserving wisdom. But actually, they were preventing you from being transformed by that wisdom. You were collecting teachings like butterflies in a jar, beautiful but dead, instead of learning to fly." She looked at Akiko directly. The teachings aren't meant to be possessed. They're meant to be embodied. You can't embody something while you're busy writing it down and filing it away. The burning freed you from the illusion that learning means accumulating words on paper. A fellow student who still took extensive notes heard about Akiko's burned journals and was horrified. "How can you not take notes? How will you remember everything?" "I don't remember everything," Akiko admitted. "I remember what matters. What doesn't stick naturally wasn't ready to be integrated anyway. Before, I had notes on hundreds of teachings I didn't understand or practice. Now I have no notes, but I actually live the teachings that have taken root." The other student wasn't convinced, but months later came back to Akiko. "I've been thinking about what you said. I realized I hide behind my notes. I write things down instead of changing my behavior. I accumulate teachings instead of applying them." Maybe I need to burn my notes too. Maybe, Akiko said. Or maybe you just need to recognize that the notes are a tool, not the goal. They can serve learning if you use them as temporary scaffolding that you eventually remove. But if you treat them as the achievement itself, they become obstacles. Years later, when Akiko became a teacher herself, she had an unusual policy. Students could take notes during the teachings, but at the end of each month, they had to burn them. If you understood, you don't need the notes, she would tell them. If you didn't understand, the notes won't help you. They'll just give you the illusion of understanding, while the real thing eludes you. Some students resisted this practice. But what if I forget important things? Then they weren't that important, Akiko would reply, or they weren't meant for you at this time. Trust that what you need to remember will stay with you. Trust that understanding that matters will integrate naturally. Let go of trying to capture and possess teachings. Let them flow through you, keeping what sticks and releasing what doesn't. One student said, "But I learn by writing. The act of writing helps me process and remember." "Then write," Akiko allowed. "But burn your notes afterward." Let writing be a process of learning, not a product of learning. Let it be the act of digestion, not the attempt at preservation. Write to understand in the moment, not to have something to refer back to. She showed them her empty shelves where journals used to be. "I'm lighter now. I carry less paper, but more understanding. The teachings live in how I respond to difficulty, how I meet each moment, and how I treat people. They don't live in notes tucked away in storage. This is the difference between dead knowledge and living wisdom." Tonight, as you rest, what notes are you clinging to? What accumulations of knowledge or experience are you treating as possessions rather than processes? What have you written down, filed away, or tucked into memory, with the intention of understanding later, but later never comes? You don't need to keep everything. You don't need to preserve every insight, remember every lesson, or capture every moment of learning. What truly transforms you doesn't need notes to survive. It lives in you, changes you, and becomes part of how you move through the world. Rest now in the understanding that learning isn't about accumulation, but about integration. That wisdom lives not on shelves, but in actions. The most important teachings don't need to be written down because they write themselves into your very being. Let yourself be like the burned journals, emptied of words but full of understanding, lighter in paper but heavier in wisdom, possessing less but being more. The notes were never the point. The understanding they pointed toward was the point. And that understanding needs no paper to live on. It lives in you. It always has. Rest now in that living wisdom, requiring no notes, no preservation, no recording. Just being, knowing, understanding from the inside out. In the hush of understanding, Zen offers us another glimpse of what it means to recognize worth not by weight or shine, but by presence. Here starts the next story. In a village known for its beautiful gardens, there lived a gardener named Sora who had inherited a plot of land from her grandmother. It was good land, fertile soil, adequate water, positioned to receive both morning and afternoon sun. Sora's neighbours on every side had transformed their properties into showcases of horticultural ambition. There were formal gardens with meticulously pruned trees, vegetable gardens yielding abundant crops, flower gardens that bloomed in careful succession throughout the seasons. But Sora's plot remained empty. Month after month, season after season, year after year, Sora did nothing with her land. She didn't plant, she didn't build, she didn't design or plan or cultivate. She simply left it alone. The neighbors whispered about this. What a waste, they said. Such good land going unused. Some thought Sora was lazy. Others thought she was confused, perhaps not knowing how to garden. A few felt insulted, as if Sora's empty plot was a criticism of their own elaborate efforts. One neighbor, a proud man named Takeshi, whose garden featured rare specimens from distant provinces, finally confronted Sora one spring morning. "Excuse me," he said, his tone barely polite, "but don't you think you should do something with your land? It's an eyesore, frankly, just weeds and wild grass. You're bringing down the beauty of the whole neighborhood." Sora, who had been sitting on her porch drinking tea, smiled gently. "What would you suggest I plant?" "Well, anything," Takeshi gestured expansively. "Vegetables, flowers, trees. Something useful or beautiful. Something that shows you care." "Come," Sora said, standing up. "Let me show you something." She led Takeshi into her supposedly empty plot, but as they walked among the unmown grass and untamed growth, Takeshi began to notice things he hadn't seen from a distance. There were wild flowers he had never seen in cultivated gardens, small, delicate blooms that seemed to glow in the morning light. There were butterflies of species he'd never encountered in his own carefully managed space. Birds nested in the natural tangles of vegetation, singing songs that his pruned and ordered trees never hosted. "Look here," Sora said, kneeling by a patch of plants. "These herbs grow wild here. They're medicinal. I gather them for the village doctor. And see this area? In autumn, mushrooms appear here that are delicious and valuable. I don't plant them. They simply come because the conditions are right." She stood and walked further into the space. "This grass that looks so messy to you, it's habitat for insects that pollinate crops for miles around. Those weeds you mentioned, several are actually rare native plants that have disappeared from cultivated areas. They only survive here because I don't pull them out." Takeshi looked around with new eyes. What he had seen as neglected chaos was actually a thriving ecosystem. What he had judged as emptiness was actually fullness of a different kind. "But you didn't plant any of this," he said, still confused. "You didn't make it happen." "Exactly," Sora replied. "I didn't plant because the land knew better than I did what should grow here. My grandmother taught me this. She said, sometimes the wisest action is to do nothing. Not from laziness, but from trust. Trust that nature has its own intelligence. Trust that things want to grow. Trust that not every space needs to be controlled and designed and managed." She bent down and touched the wild grass gently. "If I had planted a formal garden, I would be fighting against this land's nature. I would pull these native plants to make room for what I decided should be here. I would disrupt the birds and butterflies. I would impose my idea of beauty onto something that already has its own beauty. And I would be working constantly, weeding, watering, pruning, managing. Instead, I do almost nothing, and look what abundance appears." Takeshi was quiet for a long moment. He thought about his own garden, the hours of work it demanded, the constant vigilance against anything growing where he hadn't planned, the way he fought against the land's own tendencies to maintain his vision of order and beauty. "But don't you want to create something?" he asked. "Don't you want to make your mark?" "I am making my mark," Sora said. "I'm making it by not making it. I'm creating space for things to be what they naturally are, rather than forcing them to be what I think they should be. My grandmother said this too. Wu Wei, action through non-action. The doing that comes from not doing. This is not the same as doing nothing. This is carefully doing nothing, intentionally not interfering, wisely allowing." Over the following months, Takeshi found himself visiting Sora's wild plot more often. There was something restful about it, something his own controlled garden didn't offer. In his garden, every plant was in its place, every edge was trimmed, everything was as it should be, according to his plan. It was beautiful, but it was also rigid, tense. It required constant maintenance to prevent nature from asserting its own ideas. In Sora's plot, everything was relaxed. Plants grew where they wanted. Animals came and went freely. The whole space had a quality of natural ease that invited him to ease as well. One day he asked Sora, "How do you know when to act and when not to act? How do you know when doing nothing is wisdom and when it's just avoidance?" Sora thought about this carefully. "I watch," she said. "I pay attention. When I see something struggling that needs help, I help. When I see something growing well on its own, I leave it alone. When I see an invasive plant that will choke out everything else, I remove it. But most of the time, I just watch and trust. The land tells me what it needs. I don't impose my ideas onto it." She smiled. "You know the difference in your own life, don't you? Sometimes you push when pushing is needed. Sometimes you rest when rest is needed. Sometimes you act. Sometimes you wait. The wisdom is in knowing which is which. Not having a rule that you must always act or must always do nothing, but being present enough to sense what this particular moment is asking for." Years passed. Sora's plot remained unplanted, but it became known throughout the region as a refuge for rare plants and animals. Scientists visited to study the species that had disappeared from more cultivated areas but thrived in her space. Children came to see the butterflies and birds. People feeling stressed would sit at the edge of her property, finding peace in its wild beauty. Takeshi gradually changed his approach to his own garden. He didn't abandon it entirely, but he created areas where he did less, managed less, controlled less. And he was surprised to find that these areas often became his favorites. The places where unexpected beauty appeared, where nature revealed its own intelligence. One evening, sitting with Sora on her porch, looking out at her wild plot as fireflies began to light up the dusk, Takeshi said, "I used to think you were lazy. Now I understand you were wise. You saw that not every space needs to be filled. Not every plan needs to be executed. Not every action needs to be taken. Sometimes the most productive thing we can do is create space and then get out of the way." Sora nodded. "My grandmother had one more saying. The usefulness of a cup is in its emptiness. The usefulness of a house is in its empty space. The usefulness of action is in the space around it where non-action lives. You cannot act wisely if you're always acting. You cannot create room for things to grow if you're always filling every space with your own ideas. She sipped her tea, watching the fireflies. I didn't plant this garden, but I tended it through my not planting. I created it through my not creating, and what appeared was more beautiful, more alive, more true than anything I could have forced into being. Tonight, as you rest, you might consider where in your life you're overacting, over-planning, over-controlling. Where are you filling space that might be better left empty? Where are you imposing your will onto something that has its own wisdom? Where are you so busy doing that you've forgotten the power of allowing? Rest itself is a practice of productive non-action. You don't make yourself sleep. You create conditions for sleep and then get out of the way. You don't force relaxation. You allow it by ceasing to prevent it. Let yourself be like Sora's empty garden tonight, unplanted, unmanaged, allowed to be what it naturally wants to be. Trust that things want to grow, want to rest, want to restore themselves. Your job isn't to force this process, but to create space for it, and then wisely, carefully, intentionally do nothing at all. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do is nothing, and sometimes doing nothing is the hardest, most important work of all. As the lantern of awareness glows a little brighter, we come to a tale about seeing with more than the eyes. Let the stillness guide you now, and listen carefully to the next story.